I'm joined today by Cleveland Mayor Frank Jackson to discuss how cities can reduce the epidemic of police killings of Black people. We're also joined by Cleveland Police Chief Calvin Williams. Mayor Jackson asked Chief Williams to join during this interview. Police kill Black people every week in this country. About half of police killings involve someone living with mental illness or disability. The latest killings in a long history of savage police brutality, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, have inspired uprisings and now city-imposed curfews across the country. This moment arrives as cities and states are slashing budgets for services across the board: waste collection, housing, education, even healthcare services during the middle of a historically devastating pandemic. Yet police budgets remain essentially untouched. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. Thank you for joining us, Mayor Jackson, and thank you, Chief Williams, as well. I think you're muted, Mayor Jackson. There you go.
All right. All right. Well, thank you for having us.
And to Chief Williams, I just want to say, I know that policing is a hard job, even under the best of circumstances. So many people go to work every day and want to serve their community. But I'm sure you agree that in this moment, we need to ask some difficult questions. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. Mayor Jackson, you're in your fourth term in office. So you have a long history with and understanding of policing, police violence, and what's at stake here. As the killing of 12-year-old Tamir Rice has shown, the killings of Timothy Russell, Melissa Williams, and other tragic killings like the recent one of 13-year-old Tamia Chapman show, policing is troubled in Cleveland as well. Your budget includes $218 million for police this fiscal year, nearly a third of Cleveland's total spending. And even though you propose $15 million in budget cuts, you want to increase spending by $11 million relative to last year. That increase is more than the entire Department of Public Health's $10.5 million budget. Your Department of Public Safety, which houses your police department, is more than 56% of your city budget, while your Department of Public Health is about 1.6%. You spent some $6 million in settlements for Tamir Rice case, and that's just Tamir's case, not including other settlements for claims of police brutality over the years since his death. You've certainly also heard the calls to shrink the police budget that critics are saying is too large to begin with and comes at the expense of other critical services in the city, especially in light of COVID-related budget shortfalls. Will you call for reallocating some of the police budget to cover public health approaches, like, say, mental health response services, housing programs, and substance use disorder treatment services, like overdose prevention sites and other cities have used to save lives?
The answer is no. I wouldn't do that, not at this time. It does not mean that the question and the issues that you raised are not legitimate. It doesn't mean that. But, as mayors, we deal with the moment many times. And so at this particular time, I would not do that. I would not do that. But let me point out to you that part of our increase in public safety budget, particularly police, has been associated with the fact that we're under consent decree. And our consent decree really requires certain things that we do in regards to training, in regards to staffing, in regards to ratio of supervisors to patrol officers, in terms of equipment, all of those kinds of things. And all that is designed for us. I don't know about other cities, but for us, we welcome the consent decree because we attempted to do things incrementally and they stood out there by themselves, so they always fail. So a consent decree gives us a real blueprint as to how to have systemic change and reform, just not in personnel and the demographics of that personnel, but also in that culture and how the training and crisis intervention for those who are mental health and police are called, even though there's no crime being committed. So we're in a stage right now of expending a lot of money to fight on two fronts. One is to address the urban crime patterns that have a lot of association with violence, and then to also institute and implement a consent decree that we're in agreement with that really has to have investments and resources for those reforms. Now, that's just a short term. And let me switch a little bit to the other area you're talking about. You're absolutely right in terms of health. Our council now is looking at, and I've talked to the chairman of our public health committee at looking at racism as a public health issue. And so as they go through that and we begin to look at how do we add additional resources to deal with the underlying causes of those things that causes disparity, that causes inequities, all those underlying things. Now, one more thing, and then I'll let the chief respond. We've also looked at how do we address those underlying issues out in the street, because we know violence is also a health issue. And we know that many of our young people are suffering from post-traumatic stress, because even though they're not in the military, they're still suffering from an environment that has in it a prevalence of violence, whether they either participate in it, they're the victims of it, or they're witnesses all the time. So we've put some millions of dollars, several millions of dollars, even though not in health. It has been put in a recreational department in our community relations department to hire trauma-trained coaches that will be stationed in our recreation centers to be able to identify young people who are displaying symptoms of trauma, and then to assist them into getting help for them and their families. So that's several $1 million that is above what health does. We recognize it is a health issue, but our execution of things are sometimes better off in other areas of our budget. So we could get that to you also, but I'll let the chief respond to your question about the amount of money and what he's doing around the consent decree, if that's okay, or we can then go to another question.
Before the chief responds, I would like to follow up with you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate your focus on violence and on violence prevention. And it seems to me that this is a perfect way to discuss, and a perfect time to discuss, taking additional funding and using it for community violence prevention programs. I appreciate that you've started some programs outside of the health department, but as I look at your budget and I think about Cleveland, I think about the problems you're talking about that are common in so many cities. With just say a 5% transfer of the $218 million police budget to the Department of Health's $10 million budget, it would double the funding for public health. That could include pandemic response. That could also include money for education. Also something that helps reduce violence in communities, community-based violence prevention programs that operate independently of law enforcement, or even refurbishing the thousands of empty homes in Cleveland to house people experiencing homelessness or housing problems, all of which can be at the root of some of these great problems that you're talking about and do want to solve. It seems to me that committing to reducing that budget, even by just 5% for next year, is not something that is asking too much.
Well, but let's put it in the context as I see it as mayor, and that is that there is no panacea in the world. And that I don't know if you're looking at that portion of the budget as just general fund, or you're looking at that portion of the budget that's general fund and grant related, which is, if it's grant related, is a much larger amount of money. And so general fund and grants together is a higher percentage than just general fund alone. The other thing is that I find that everything that we have been successful at as a city has always been a community effort. And I find the biggest mistake that a lot of people make is the assumption that government is the solution to all the problems, which I believe is the biggest mistake, because the reliance on government is the biggest mistake you could make. This is more about how does our society, how does our economic system, how does our social system function, and does it function in an equitable way? Does it function in a way that reduces or eliminates disparity? Does it function in a way that does not have classism or racism as a key component of economic prosperity and quality of life? That to me. So I always look at how does the philanthropic community and how does the private sector assist in helping to reduce these disparities and inequities. And then, but I'm agreeing with you. Don't think I'm not that I'm not agreeing with you. I'm just saying at this time, just for me, I guess I could politically and be right at this point and say that yeah, I would do that, and that's a small amount of money. But if my since I don't do those kind of things, I'm just being honest with you that at this time I would not recommend that. But I agree with you that there needs to be a greater focus there, and that we would be willing to do our part in order to accomplish that in conjunction with a broader community effort. But we would not be willing to do that just to do it and say that we've done something when I know it's not going to produce any different outcome. So that is the context of me saying no. Is not a no that I disagree. So you understand.
That's clear, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. It just seems to me, I hear you, but it seems to me that when you talk about, reliance on government, we're in a extraordinary moment with this pandemic and with these uprisings now on top of a pandemic, a kind of crisis on top of a crisis. It seems to me that we've learned these lessons. The concepts that you're citing and looking out for and wanting to make sure we resolve systemic racism, violence in policing. It seems to me that the failure is clear, that the government has failed in so many ways its vulnerable communities. And if not now, if this is not the moment to re-inject some money, some capital, some resources into vulnerable communities, I honestly can't imagine a time that would be more urgent than this. It almost frightens me to think of a time that would be more urgent than this.
I can respond. What I'm trying to say to you is that we are crisis oriented as a society. The time was a long time ago. It is not now. It is a long time ago, and then we would not be in this position. This particular moment gives us an opportunity. And what you're saying, I agree with, and that opportunity can be taken advantage of and led by government by saying, government, if you would do this, then it would give at least at minimum a symbolic direction of where we should go. I'm saying that my experience is that every time this thing happens, every 4 or 5 years, that symbolic gesture is made, and then we're back at the table again addressing the same thing because it doesn't work that way. If we're going to have real change, we have to go into the bowels of our operation. We have to go into the bowels of the beast, I call it. And that beast functions, and its existence, its prosperity, its standard of living and quality of life is built on inequities, disparities, and racism. And so and it will allow people like me, mayors, to do things that are symbolic, but because it knows that it means nothing to its ultimate control and power and its ability to continue inequities and disparities. So for me, I have to force it to be part of the solution, which is more of a difficult thing. And so I'm saying to them, and this is where you're absolutely right, this is the moment again, here we are again. If you are sincere about not being here, because they'll say the right thing, if you're sincere about not being here again, then this is what you have to do. We would be willing to do our part, but we're not doing that just to be as symbolic as so to get past the moment and you don't ante up. We're not doing that. So that is the kind of conversation that I believe is a much effective and has a better and more sustainable outcome. Because I'm agreeing with you, approaches are different, but your assessment is right on. If I can have the chief, okay?
Sure.
Sir. I know
Hi,
there was
Chief.
a lot thrown out there, so I'll just start a little bit with the budgetary part of this. You're right, the Division of Police's budget is over $200 million. But within that budget, there are things that go to some of the topics that you talked about. Police are the front line in dealing with folks with mental health and substance abuse issues. We've been kind of thrust into that over the last 20 years, I feel, because the people that are responsible for treating folks like that and taking care of them have kind of abdicated that. So you
Chief,
see,
I agree with you entirely. And in fact, this is a great point to make, and tie back to the mayor's point just a moment ago, that we need to radically alter the way we think about public safety in cities. And I think you're right that police work very hard and in fact are thrown at these situations where they do not have the training or
right.
the understanding to take them on. And that's where I find myself confused. And I think that's where a lot of protesters are also confused. Because why don't we restructure these cities? Why don't we, is this not the moment, like the mayor was even saying, to radically alter what we think about public safety, how we achieve public safety, what even public safety is? It certainly doesn't seem to me that public safety is sending an armed officer to a person having a mental health crisis. And I'm sure you agree. It sounds like you do.
Well, the point I'm trying to make is we have to do the best we can with what we have right now, because the idea that you're talking about takes more than city government, takes more than Division of Police to actually accomplish. It takes, like the mayor said, the private sector. It takes the philanthropic sector. It takes the healthcare sector to go back to doing what they did 30 years ago. So, but within our budget, knowing that those things aren't happening at the pace that they should, we have a dedicated crisis intervention coordinator. We actually have two at a supervisory level. That's all they do, is they coordinate training for our officers and dealing with people in mental health crisis as well as substance abuse crisis. We had one of the first major crisis intervention training programs in this part of the country, where all officers were given a minimum of 40 hours of training in crisis intervention. We mandated that before a lot of the agencies in this country did that, and we stuck to that. We had over 2/3 of our officers within the division trained, and almost 90% of our frontline officers trained in crisis intervention and dealing with people in crisis. We also have crime prevention tools. You talked about the community crime prevention tools, and that should go back out to the community. That's true. Agencies should be funded at a level that they can implement their crime prevention programs and make a difference. But we have to hit it from more than one angle. So we deal with crime, but we also have crime prevention tools within our budget. We have officers dedicated just to that, not to being out and enforcing the law, but doing crime prevention activities with our community partners. So it's not just a budget for police officers to do law enforcement, it's a budget for police officers to do a lot of things.
But isn't that, I mean, I hear you, Chief, and I appreciate all of that. It just seems to me that the police, the role you defined for the police, which I agree with, which is to solve crime, is correct. That theory is correct, I think. But why send crime solvers to people who are suffering with a mental health crisis or with a substance use disorder? Even no matter how many hours of training they receive, they've not spent their lives dedicated to these groups of vulnerable people, and we've seen the outcome so many times over and over and over again. It sickens me, and I don't understand.
Right. Can I tell you what we're doing in Cleveland? We're not just sending a crime fighter. In Cleveland, we pair that officer whose sole job is to intervene with people in crisis with an actual professional, either a social worker or clinician that has that expertise. We are trying to fill this gap until the community that's responsible for it can take it back over. So we can't just say, no, we abdicate that. That's not a function for law enforcement, because we're at the front lines of it. We see it every day. Probably 60–70% of our calls involve a person in some kind of crisis, be it mental health or substance abuse. So we can't ignore it, because as you know, there are tragic outcomes if our officers aren't trained properly, if they aren't aware of psychosis that people may be going through, and if they don't have services that they can take folks to rather than taking them to jail. Our preference right now in our program is to get that person help and treatment rather than to incarcerate that person.
Sure. I hear you, Chief, and this may be more of a question for the mayor. The thing that is confusing to me, Mr. Mayor, hearing you and the Chief speak about this, that I'd like some clarity on, is you talk about needing philanthropy dollars, needing other community dollars in order to achieve some of these goals. But as mayor, I mean, do you not have the power to adjust the city budget? You have hundreds of millions of dollars at what I think is your power to route towards different agencies. Is that not true? And is it also then, am I to surmise from what the point you're making that the way that the Cleveland city budget is dedicated currently is exactly right, and that there is no room to move dollars towards services to vulnerable communities, and the only way to do that is through philanthropic donor dollars?
No, our approach is to leverage money, to cover the cost of providing mental health or drug abuse kind of help. You know, it probably would cover almost all of our budget there. I know it would cover all the public safety budget just to address the issue in a minimum sense. So what I'm saying, we look at how do we leverage dollars and how do we do that in a way. And in the past, what has happened, and it still happens, not everywhere, it happens everywhere, is that the pronouncement of something that is perhaps the right kind of thing to pronounce does not have enough legs to sustain itself beyond the pronouncement. It's just for the moment. It's getting past the moment, then it's business as usual. So what we like to do is to leverage money, leverage it, and then with that leveraging, to have a buy-in and investment by others other than government to be part of the solution, as opposed to others believing that government can be part of the solution. And in terms of dollars, you're right. You can, you know, when we have a operating budget, and you know ours is small compared to the large cities, but our operating budget that would cover the police and health and things like that is I think $670 something million in total. That's the operating budget. And then you have under that waste collection and cutting lots, paving streets, you have all that stuff. Police and safety is the lion's share, as you pointed out. So in there, if you're talking about $3, $4, $5, $6 million moving here and there, you can manage that in that kind of budget. And now, just to do that, to make a statement, to me, is not sufficient. To do that as part of a partnership and leveraging for others to put additional dollars and to redirect their resources in a way that is focused on certain things, to me, that it has more legs and it's more sustainable. Now, let me put that into our reality, because the theory, the concept is perfect, and I've laid out pretty much like some minimum condition for us doing something like that. But let me give you today's reality. We budgeted a recession, which meant that in our budget, we hedged against a recession. We looked at there being some economic downturn after the presidential election, and perhaps early next year. And as a result of that, we built in a cushion that will allow us to sustain our operations while that recession was going on, depending on the duration and the depth. Well, here it is with COVID-19, and now there's civil unrest. Rather than be in the first quarter of next year or after November, here it is right now. And so we're losing substantial amounts of revenues coming into the city to support our ability to even have police officers or to have a recreation center or even pick up trash or things like that. At the same time, the economy it begins to turn down and people get laid off, then we get that it escalates in terms of the lack of revenue. So we now have to look and say, well, if we're going to stay in business, we're going to have to look at our operating budget and look at our revenues coming in and our costs of operating the city, because we, by law, cannot have an unbalanced budget. That means that either we raise more money or we cut or we do a combination of the two. So with that in mind, our main focus right now is how do we sustain, since our bottom line is not profit, we're not in the business to make profit, we're in the business to provide service. So we're not looking at monies going to shareholders, we're looking at services going to people, and which includes health, and it includes safety. So since we can't really move around $3, $4, $5 million right now, you say, we are now looking at how do we get through this moment. Once we get through this moment, then the kind of things that you're talking about, if the conversation becomes genuine and sincere with the broader community, it becomes a different conversation, because then we can then leverage some money to accomplish some goal. Now, the final thing on it, I also found that the only way things are sustainable is if people believe it's in their interest. And if the beast, so to speak, and everyone who functions in the beast, including you and me, don't have the bad intention to cause profits or to cause wealth or to cause privilege based on the oppression of people, right? Our job is to kind of mitigate or neutralize that kind of function in institutionalized behavior. So for us to ensure that this thing has legs, we have to get in place people who are sincere about these things and are genuine in their efforts. Because what will happen as we come out of this, what I call a recession now, a result of a pandemic and civil unrest. As we come out of this, that discussion will occur. The further we get away from it, the less people will pay attention to it. So we're going to have to infuse a small amount of money, at least, in order to establish and demonstrate the sincerity along with our partners to do it, and then have ongoing ratcheting up of that as we see the changes made. And I apologize for rambling. But
no, Mr. Mayor, that was a helpful answer.
So give you an example. My last state of the city was right on this subject, was that Cleveland, even though we have a city of poverty and we have a city of predominantly minority, and of that minority group, predominantly African American. And even though Cleveland is perceived to be the butthole of the world sometime, right? When you look at perception, not reality, when you look at gross domestic product and gross domestic capital, Cleveland, in the Cleveland region, is a pretty wealthy area, is very wealthy. So how is it, since we're so wealthy and we have such a robust economy and the per capita share of the economy is so high, how is it that we have all this poverty? How is it that we have all this lack of education? How is it that we have all this lack of health when we're the epicenter of a major infrastructure for delivery of health with the Cleveland Clinic, University Hospital, Metro Health? How is all this? It is because we have institutionalized inequities and institutionalized disparities, that the system just functions that way. That's what I call the beast.
But and can't you as mayor, I mean, isn't that why you're elected, Mr. Mayor?
I'm trying to get to it.
Okay.
And so the question is exactly what you said. In all this wealth and prosperity, how do we have all this? Is because we have inequity and disparity as institutions. So what then becomes my role as mayor? How do I impact that? How do I impact that and show a better outcome in terms of sharing and prosperity and quality of life? How do I impact that? That becomes my role. And the things that you suggested a methodology, which I'm not opposed to. But at the same time, as I begin to say what the city should do, I'm using the bully pulpit of the mayor and say what you should do, we should do as a community. Yes, the city will do this. And we're already doing that, and we're doing that, and we're doing this, and we're doing this. But we're willing to step that up and do more. But we're not going to do that, society, Cleveland community, if in fact you don't step up. And your survival as a broader community is based on your addressing these systemic issues that have allowed us to repeat the same things over and over again, to have the same discussion. So look, I'm 74 years old. I went through the Huff rides all the way up to the current situation. I live in an area that it bears the burden of inequities and disparity and crime and all of that stuff. So I live it, I know it. And so what I'm saying to you, how do we as a community address these issues? And I will not give other people a bye, and I will not say that we're going to do something, even though it may get an amen at that moment, that I know has no legs to it. It cannot be sustainable because we have not really changed the nature of this beast. And that is my job, whether I can control it through budgetary means or I can control it through a bully pulpit, all of that. That is my job. And that is what I attempt to do. If I had complete control over things, things would be different. But since I don't, I do what I do in the way that I believe is the best. But again, I want to emphasize that your assessment is perfectly correct. How we do it, I have to look at it in a practical side as to my reality.
That makes sense to me, Mayor. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's move on to talk about some of the hows a little bit more, Mr. Mayor. I want to share some polling with you. Polling from the Justice Collaborative Institute, an organization that is affiliated with the Appeal and my organization, along with the Data for Progress, suggests that 9 in 10 voters support creating an agency of non-law enforcement based emergency responders that would shift most first responder responsibilities away from traditional law enforcement agencies. And that's because most problems arising from substance use disorders, mental health diagnoses, and poverty require medical professionals and social workers, not criminal enforcement or armed officers, like we were discussing earlier. Law enforcement officers are not trained or equipped to be experts in responding to mental health crises. As we covered on this program, as we talked about moments ago, the model works well in multiple cities across America already. Eugene, Austin, Denver have implemented similar programs. Lawmakers in Congress and in the Senate have proposed national versions of this. In Austin, Texas, for example, the new law means that when a person calls 911, the operator says police, fire, or mental health. If a person chooses mental health, a trained medic arrives instead of an armed officer. Has Cleveland ever considered creating this type of program?
Yes. The answer is yes. Let me explain, then I'll ask the chief to get into detail. What we've done is we created our crisis intervention teams and trained officers in that. We fully recognize when there's a crisis, 80% of those crises we go to that are either mental health crisis or drug or alcohol induced crisis, there has been no crime committed. So we fully recognize that we are the most inappropriate people to be there, but we're called, the families call us. There's no one else for them to call. And so they call us. And so that's why we train them, so that we can do a de-escalation thing as opposed to getting into a traditional police of I'm gonna be in control, you gonna do, it doesn't work, right? And that is why we began to work with our drug and alcohol board so that we can team up with them. So as we go, then we call them and we kind of step back, meaning the police, step back and let them have control over it. But what you're talking about is probably the best solution, where you have people who are not police officers, but people who are clinicians, professional people, who would then go and respond to that, and if need be, have public safety support, because just because someone, you may think, some people think that, well, it's just mental health and it's just alcohol and drugs, but they get pretty violent. And so you're going to have somebody there to back them up. But yes, I agree with that.
Well, I mean, the mayor summed it up. And what I told you about our program that has co-responders with our officers is exactly that. We looked at the program in Denver, which uses sometimes fire or emergency medical medics to respond with clinicians for those calls. We looked at that program, but as the mayor stated, we have a large portion of our calls that involve people in those type of crises that do entail some kind of violence being committed. So that clinician is not going to respond to that call and not be effective until that situation has calmed down. So that's why we currently have a co-responder program where that clinician responds with the officer. If the scene is safe, that clinician takes over and does whatever needs to be done. And in our case, our preference is to get that person to a mental health facility to get further evaluation and to work on a treatment plan. A lot of the folks that we deal with now currently have treatment plans with our facilities around the city. They just don't follow them because there's no connection to anybody else once they leave that hospital. There's no follow-up of any degree because, as you know, a lot of these folks are transient and homeless. So there is, the need for us, because we do get those calls, to have our officers trained, to have that person with the expertise and the background and the training to deal with that, to go with the officer so that we make sure that we have a better outcome. And now our officers, again, for probably the past 9.5 years, have all been trained in this program. All the officers don't respond. We have specialized officers that only respond to those type of calls. And again, until we can get the mental health, medical professional community to step up and do what they have been trained to do, what they trained to do for 12, 14, 15 years, we can't wait for that because these things are happening day in and day out. But the mayor's point about this whole thing is, it's not just what happens in Cleveland with government and with police agencies, it's what happens with our partners out there, be it in the private sector, the philanthropic sector, or the hospital sector. They have to step up. The city can't do it by itself. Government can't do it by itself. And that's what we've been trying to do here.
But you know what? While the chief was speaking, I was thinking about what you said. I think it's a great idea. And what I'm asking my people to take down a note, because this is what my commitment to you is. I would at least do an assessment of what would be the infrastructure necessary to have that kind of call of somebody have an option of mental health or crisis-oriented health, and what the budgetary obligation would be to that. And if you did it based on a magnitude of our cost of service, I would suspect right now it would be a huge amount of money.
Yes.
But what would we do if we could I'm thinking out loud, what could we do if we set up a pilot or created something? So I hear what you're saying, even though we're doing what we're doing, and I think we're doing a pretty good job of it. We had a crisis not too long ago. How many years ago with Tanisha Anderson?
2014.
2014, about 6 years ago, where police were called on 2 or 3 occasions to this location, and the family wanted the person out. So they called us, but there was no crime. And so we just couldn't remove them. But as time went on, after being called to the scene at least 2 times, maybe 3 times, we got to the point that we were able to remove the person from the house. But as a result of that, the person wound up dying in our custody. So we're blamed, right? Well, it wasn't a crime. In this situation that you described and what we've attempted to do, we would say, well, we learned from that, by the way, and say, well, we would go there, we would try to de-escalate and stabilize, but we need a professional to deal with this, and then we bag up. Your suggestion is that why don't you create institutionalize an arm of your police department that would be a public health service, even though not under health, it would be under. So my commitment to you is I'll look at that.
I appreciate your openness to it, Mr. Mayor. I've another police tactics question for you with this in mind. This last December, more than 20 officers engaged in a high-speed pursuit of a simple carjacking in Cleveland, going over 80 miles per hour through East Cleveland. As school was letting out, a 13-year-old girl, Tamia Chapman, was struck and killed in the course of that chase. A helicopter or other aircraft could have tracked that car without risk to surrounding people. Why does Cleveland allow its police officers to use car chase tactics when evidence shows that they present tremendous risk to surrounding community members and even to the police officers involved in the chase, especially in busy neighborhoods? Would you also commit to calling for the phasing out of these sorts of high-speed police vehicles pursuits immediately?
So before the chief answered, we learned exactly that high-speed chases are not the preferred thing. And I believe the chief's general police order and our policy is that, first of all, to engage or to continue in a high-speed chase, you have to have supervisional permission to do that. So they have to call it in. And then they have to demonstrate that it is something that they could accomplish without having to do the high speed of chase, or it is creating a substantial danger, so they should not do it. Okay, so I'll let the chief tell you what our policy is, and then I will actually, and I don't know this answer, so I'm gonna just open it up, is to, based on that, if we have done any, if there have been any administrative charges associated with that activity.
Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry, Chief. We're running out of time, so I want to get to one more question. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I can speak to you for one last thing, Mayor.
Before you do that, do we do administrative charges?
We have an investigation.
We have an investigation on that based on that they violated our pursuit policy or not? We
have an investigation right now that will be finished up pretty soon that will cover the pursuit from start to finish. But what I do want to say is our division since 2014 has probably the most restrictive pursuit policy in the country. It's only for violent felons or a perceived violent felons or a perceived person under the influence.
And as a matter of fact, we've gotten criticized for that, so we get it from both ends, but go ahead.
So my last question, Mr. Mayor, is there's a lot of anger and frustration out there right now, as you well know. Wide segment of Americans feel this over what they see as a failing democracy, the way our cities, our states, our country is run, systemic racism, stuff we've talked about throughout this program today, decades of police violence that you have, and uprisings around it that you have experienced yourself, Mr. Mayor, that you spoke about, with incrementalist reforms that often seem like they never actually achieve anything. And here we are again, you and I, Mr. Mayor and Chief, we're talking about yet another dead Black person due to the actions of a police officer caught on video again, so horribly predictable, the consequence of long-standing violence and racist policy and practice. It's another tepid response to another killing, which resembles thousands upon thousands of similar killings. Names, some we know, some who knows if we'll ever know because a camera wasn't turned on at the time. It's profoundly troubling to me. I'm just a journalist though. You're a mayor of a major city with the power to make change. Do you feel that sense of urgency? Do you feel that anger? Do you feel you're meeting that anger and that urgency in this moment, right now, today? What are you doing in solidarity with, say, the Black Lives Matter movement? What are you doing to meet the demands of the protesters to stop police violence?
Well,
to make Black lives safer?
Can I say this? I've felt it. I don't need this moment to feel it. I've felt it. And you know, my grandchildren have felt it. So it's not esoteric or some theoretical concept to me. It's personal to me, right? So we do what we do in order to address these issues. That is why we embrace a consent decree that it gives us, as you said, incremental changes never work because they stand out there by themselves. You need an overall blueprint, a framework that in a document that holds you accountable for reform. And that reform has to be at bottom, a reform that changes the culture of policing. Because at the end of the day, we are an urban center and we are going to use force. There's no question about it, because we have to deal with urban crime, a lot of which is violent. And everyone out there, black, white, or Hispanic, or indifferent, that may fall under what we're talking about is not necessarily a good guy or a good lady. And so there are going to be the use of force. The question becomes, did you use that force in an appropriate way, in a constitutional way, and were you professional about the way you did it? The way in which it happened most recently was completely unnecessary, right? So the repercussions of that is what we're bearing right now all over the country. And as you can see, is actually going beyond the United States into other parts of the world. And you look at what's happening in other nations, whether it's in Hong Kong or whether it's in the Soviet Union, you can go anywhere you want. It is this basic underlining thing, because people demonstrate, people who genuinely and sincerely a part of this thing are demonstrating because there's an underlining current of injustice. And that's why they're doing. So now, so I'm in full support, and we've been working on that all the time. This moment is not creating an additional sense of urgency to me, because we're in that mode. Now, that being said, Black Lives Matter, we have as the local group and the national group, we have a lot of local advocates of different things. Some of them are more sincere than others, to be honest with you. You're a journalist, and you perfectly know that once the camera's off, then the enthusiasm and the passion tends to leave sometime. And so there are members of all these organizations who will be there even when there's no camera on, and when there's no credibility thing that they have to build up. And we gladly work with them. Just working with organizations, however, I have found doesn't get you necessarily a better result, other than them just telling you how wrong you are and what you should do. And so I want to, in all honesty, let you know that yes, we work with people, but we work with people in a way. Now, I will say this, that our local Black Lives Matter have not just given up the cause because the camera's gone away. They haven't. They don't get the attention when there's no high profile stuff. They don't get the attention, so they're not up there. But they're pretty steady. They're trying to focus on stuff. And then the final thing, then I'll let the chief respond, is that our tragedy is that there are those who have agendas who are working those agendas at the expense of legitimate concerns. And we are seeing that now. We've seen it in the past, and I imagine it will continue in the future. And so those agendas, we have to weed out, and those who then claim themselves to be the legitimate spokesman for are not necessarily that, because they have an agenda. They're just using a tragedy and the death of individuals and the cause. They're using that for something entirely different than what they're talking about. But those who are legitimate and sincere about it, we'll gladly work with them. And I will say Black Lives Matter is in Cleveland has been very responsible in this most recent social unrest around this. I will say that for them.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Chief, I'm sorry, we are so over time, and I have to stop this interview.
The initial
yes.
point,
yes.
The Division of Police, since we entered into the consent decree process in 2015, a compared to the 5 years prior to that. Our average police-involved shootings that were where we actually shot somebody or killed somebody averaged about 9 a year in those 5 years. 2015 to 2019, we've had 11 total for all those years combined. So along with our use of non-deadly force going down by about 40%. So the things we're doing here are working. So we learned our lessons years ago, and our officers have bought into the culture that we're now implementing over the last 5 years, which is professional, respectful service to our community. And it's shown in the numbers from 9 a year, an average, some years even 17, to a total of 11 from 2015 to 2019.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Chief. Appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining us.
I thank you for the dialogue, because I really do, because it's challenging. It's challenging. And so, but you challenging us and putting it in our face like that in a respectful way is fine, because it then forces us to think about it, because that one thing that you mentioned, I'm thinking about. So I want to know that I appreciate the conversation, the intensity of it, and all that. It has helped me to kind of formulate some things, and I will follow up on that one thing. Well,
I really appreciate those kind words, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
Be safe. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We'll be live again tomorrow at noon to talk further about the policing crisis in America and the death of Breonna Taylor with members of Louisville City Council.